My name's Parkin. One of the greatest honours I have is to be the secretary of the Bristol Radical History Group, though I live in France, not in Bristol. So, what I'm going to talk about is a kind of my memories of 1968, being a political activist then and subsequently. And so first of all, I want to situate 1968 in the era before it. Looking around the room, there are some people who I can imagine can remember the 1950s, which mainly you don't want to remember, was just sort of beige, terrible time. So pallid, politically conformist. And in the 1960s, there was a blossoming of more colour, a possibility of social change, a strong sense that the world could be changed, and indeed we were going to change it. So there's teenage music, there's hippie clothes, there's Carnaby Street, there's a counterculture. In 1965, there was an alternative international poetry incarnation in the Albert Hall. Were you there? Something of it? Yeah. I was there. So alongside that, there was political activism from in the mid to late 60s. I had burst into revolutionary politics in 1962 and had already spent 6 years demonstrating, being beaten up by the police on with the anarchists on an anti-war march, being disciplined by my head teacher for selling a Trotskyist youth paper, as well as attending umpteen less interesting meetings in smoke-filled rooms. I did produce, and failed to get copied, a timeline, because it's quite interesting to look back at what actually happened in the year 1968. For example, the Beatles' animated film The Yellow Submarine came out. And that feels like that ought to be more recent than that long ago, 50 years ago. And also Dad's Army was first on the telly, so that also feels like it connects with current times. But then there are a whole load of other issues throughout the year, a lot to do with race. In February, some 1,500 Asians had arrived in Britain, forced out from Kenya, and the Labour government introduced the Commonwealth Immigration Act in April 1968, reducing the right of entry for people to the UK unless they had a grandparent born here. And then there were other kind of key events like the assassination of Martin Luther King in the April and the assassination of Robert Kennedy in later. But also in the Abortion Act of 1967 came into force in April 1968. So the whole of kind of things which mark in a way modern times started then. What I'm going to do is provide some memories, some snapshots, mainly from my memory, of either things that were very politically significant or others where I happened to be there, kind of key moments. I'm not covering feminist issues because Sheila and Hilary covered that in an earlier workshop. And I'm not covering student occupations because that was also covered earlier. Though I do remember in a student occupation in 1972 arguing that the students ought to leave the occupied building and go down and join the miners on the picket line because the 1972 miners' strike had started. But I'm mainly covering the optimisms of 1968 because the feeling, the sense of 1968, this really strong sense that anything was possible, we could change the world, was overpoweringly strong. So I'm going to cover the protest against the Vietnam War, Paris in May '68, a bit about the Ford equal pay strike, though I think Hilary and Roger are going to talk about that again in another workshop. But however, I'm also going to talk about the downsides. This isn't in a kind of spirit of BBC balance, but also to address the question, what the fuck happened? How were we so badly defeated? How did we begin being so badly defeated on and on and on after that? So I'm going to talk about Enoch Powell and the Rivers of Blood, We're going to talk about the Prague Spring and the invasion of Czechoslovakia. But Vietnam, for people of my generation, the Vietnam War was our defining obsession. Unlike the wars of the present day, we could and did believe that there was an entirely right and an entirely wrong side. And we were on the side of the oppressed Vietnamese peasants and workers and against American imperialism. In 1968, the Viet Cong commenced the Tet offensive, and there were many protests against the Vietnam War. George Brown, who was Wilson's foreign secretary, came to speak at my university, and we protested, disrupting the event, storming out noisily and shouting, "Murderer!" and being hauled from the hall. It was rather feeble, but we could do that. This was before the March Grosvenor Square demonstration. I was at the October one, and I remember being very irritated by other students linking arms and chanting "Ho, ho, Ho Chi Minh" and just running into people in front of them. This was a really revolutionary act. I see in the footage outside about Paris, there's people in demonstrations in Paris running into the people in front of them. I never pointed that. But the March demonstration was famous for being a police riot. And we've all seen the photos and footage of their attacks as some of the demonstrators tried to enter the US embassy. My now husband was involved in the heroic act of throwing ball bearings down so that police horses fell. The news footage is that it was marbles, but he points out the horses would have been able to crunch up the marbles under their feet, but ball bearings fell. Please, I don't want to get involved with the animal rights, the people, anxiety about the situation of the poor horses, but the police on those horses were appalling. But the most spectacular manifestation of the kind of in Western Europe of the new militant consciousness was, of course, in Paris in May 1968. Where students linked up with wildcat strikes of up to 10 million workers. And for a few days, the movement seemed capable of overthrowing the government. And we certainly had a sense, every day you read the paper, you had a sense that maybe the French government could be overthrown. The police then occupied the Somme, and there were massive street battles in the streets of Paris between students throwing cobblestones and the police firing tear gas. And the footage outside on that thing in the hallway is very good. Some students from the UK did go to Paris. There was a transport strike, so it wasn't at all easy to go to Paris. Well, I'm glad that Sheila's come in the room because I can now mention a mutual friend of ours, Simon Miller, went to Paris on his folding molten bicycle to join from Brighton, University of Sussex. He cycled to Paris, talking about people, to join the demonstration. But the students did not disperse. There were 3 hours of brutal fighting. And 300 people were injured, but fortunately there was no gunfire and no deaths. But the following day, Charles de Gaulle woke up and orchestrated a counter-demonstration. There's a poster upstairs from Paris of sheep. It says something that Maintenant normal et retenu, with the sheep walking on them. So de Gaulle orchestrated this demonstration by middle class, pro the dominant order, and they flooded the Champs-Élysées. And he called an election. He made disparaging remarks about student leaders. So, for example, he talked about Daniel Cohn-Bendit as having a dirty jersey, and we marched in support. I can't remember where. And we chanted, "We all have dirty jerseys," which I think we probably did. But May passed into June, workers and students wanted some changes, but the elections were to go back into power. At the same time, on these islands, the repressive RUC battened civil rights marchers in Ulster, at the beginning of the civil rights movement in Ulster. I now want to mention a bit the Ford sewing machinists, equal pay, regrading strike. Women in June, sewing machinists at Ford's walked out. They made car seat covers, and this was completely crucial to the production of cars. And as the car seats ran out, car production halted. And it was caused by a regrading exercise. They were informed that their jobs were graded in category B, less skilled, instead of category C, more skilled, and that they would be paid 15% less than the rate received by men. Following the intervention of Barbara Castle, Wilson's Secretary of State for Employment and Productivity, the strike ended after 3 weeks as a result of a deal which immediately increased their rate of pay to 8% below that to men, but which rose to the full category B rate the following year, and to category C following a further strike in 1984. This event is significant for me because the whole of my working life I worked on equal opportunities, and this was a precursor of the 1970 Equal Pay Act, though it was already in the pipeline. The Dagenham strike had a real impact on that. And that Equal Pay Act brought the UK in conformity with Article 141 of the Treaty of Rome, and that's again interesting because it shows that Europe was kind of a driver, which said that each member state shall ensure that the principle of equal pay for male and female workers, or equal work, or work of equal value is applied. So it's kind of, it's again, connections with modern times and the issue of Europe. Okay, so that's kind of with the student occupations, and I'm not mentioning whole loads of things internationally, like for example the Black Panthers in America and civil rights struggles in America. This was a time of extraordinary optimism. We had a sense that the tide had turned, our time was arriving. But there were undertones and the opposite impetus, and I think it's important to recollect those. And I think particularly the issue of race in this country. I have been aware of the existence of racism. In the 1950s childhood, I remember being on a bus, on the top deck of a bus, and we ran to look out the window because there was a black man walking by. But in the 1950s, we were called in colours. We did not see black people. And I also witnessed the aftermath of the 1958 Notting Hill white race riot. I saw houses which had been burned out with fascist slogans, and I don't know if it was wogs or was it niggers outdoor on the wall. And there were fascists who attended the Wimbledon Youth Department. But the Labour Party, as ever, laid the kindling for racist fires with the Commonwealth Immigration Act, which I already mentioned. But in 1968, extreme racism entered the mainstream. Enoch Powell, Wolverhampton MP, spoke to the Birmingham Tories, predicting rivers of blood if mass immigration continued. So far, so bad. But we were truly horrified when London dockers marched in his support. I had thought, until recently, that this was merely sad evidence that workers could be reactionary, which indeed workers can be. But researching this period, I found that MI5 produced a report saying that the supposedly spontaneous strike and demonstration in the East India Docks was actually led by Harry Pearman, supporter of the anti-communist fundamentalist group Moral Rearmament. And that was a very strong and pernicious, kind of semi-respectable, kind of UKIP-y kind of movement. While a separate demonstration by porters from Smithfield Meat Market in support of Powell had been got up by a fascist who had stood for Oswald Mosley's party in the 1966 general election. So just as the left went around trying to agitate and organise groups of workers to do things, so the right also did do so. So the next downside is Czechoslovakia. Despite the differences on the left that we had on whether the Soviet Union was a degenerated or deformed worker state or state capitalist, for many there was a view, if push comes to shove, there were two sides internationally. We were on the side of the Soviet Union. And so but we were enthusiastic over Prague Spring in Czechoslovakia, where Dubček tried to introduce socialism with a human face. And I can totally remember my shock on holiday in Italy on August the 21st, the Soviet Union with 250,000 Warsaw Pact troops invaded Czechoslovakia. I joined a few holiday makers with makeshift banners bemusing the ice cream sellers and protesting this. But the invasion stopped the initiatives of Prague Spring reforms and strengthened the authoritarian wing of the Warsaw Pact countries. So was the tide turned? On the one side in the zeitgeist was, in summary, the student occupations, Paris in May, protests over the Vietnam War, the Ford Equal Pay Strike, the Abortion Act, along with folk music, the Beatles, Rolling Stones, and the first Isle of Wight Festival. On the other side, there was Enoch Powell, Moral of the Armament, the Immigration Act, the invasion of Czechoslovakia, Des O'Connor, and Engelbert Humperdinck. So I'm now supposed to invite you to discuss. You
seem to imply that before the 1960s not a lot really happened, but we had the foundation of the National Health Service in 1945, which is still with us. We had the revolution in China, still with us. The revolution in Korea, still with us. The revolution in Cuba, still with us. With the formation of C&D, various anti-war movements, the campaign against British involvement, I think it was in Burma. All these were sort of monumental things that still live with us today. So they've probably had far more reaching impact on our lives at this very moment than anything that happened in the 1960s or indeed 1968.
Thank you. Yes, certainly the 1945 Labour government did, in a top-down way, introduce a heap of important reforms, of which the NHS was most important. But in terms of the kind of bottom-up, kind of protesting, yes, C&D was important. I was on all the master marches in the late 1950s. But there was somebody in a previous session talked about a light bulb movement. We were talking about 1970, but I think in 1968 there was a bigger flowering, people are nodding, of the alternative left sense, of the sense that it was possible to change. I'm not sure that I would want to, Cuba, okay, I'll give you Cuba, but I'm not sure I'd want to laud Korea or China as examples of totally progressive movement. But you're right.
Can I give a different perspective on the 50s? Again, it's often dismissed. But think about washing machines, refrigerators, vacuum cleaners, all things that were actually liberating women from some of the more from domestic drudgery to some extent. I mean, my grandmother used to get up at 6:30 in the morning and work solidly, looking after a family of 4 until she went to bed. And I mean, I think the 50s start that way. Also, we have in the mid-50s the emergence of rock and roll as initially a genuinely raw working class music before it gets homogenised by the Beatles in the 1960s.
Yeah, I think there's an entirely fair point. I mean, if one was giving a kind of like writing a whole book on the history of the 1950s and 60s, you'd want to talk about all of those things. I actually was talking about kind of protest movements more, and the washing machine stuff I give you entirely, and rock and roll. Then certainly it's wrong to kind of go 1950s bad, 1960s good. I mean, if I suggested that is wrong, because obviously rock and roll didn't start earlier, as did C&D.
Can I say something about the kitchen appliances, which in many ways a very, very valid point. On the other hand, that technologising of the kitchen. I know my mother got a twin tunnel, and it was a fantastic liberation for her. But it was also used, particularly in the United States, to describe women as a kind of scientific technologist of the home. That's the point Betty Friedan makes in her book, The Feminist Mystique. It was also used to get women out of jobs, back into the kitchen. And then you've got this thing called domestic science, which was kind of supposed to keep them there. So I think both points are valid. But I think you have to see the other side too.
I just want to add something that I think does link the 50s to what you're saying about 68. And that is that throughout the 50s and early 60s...
So could you speak into the...
Sorry. Through the 50s and into the early 60s, there was a sort of only semi-clandestine, really active gay culture, especially in cities. And then in I forget if it was 67 or 68, you had the decriminalization of homosexuality, and I think that was a big part of that of things being different, people can be different, we don't all have to be the same. So I'm just throwing that into the mix.
Awful than 67.
Yeah.
I have just like a more kind of simple question. I was wondering from that year 1968, like what's one of your like highlight happy memories from the year that you take away, that you think back to? Things like your life.
In my life, I actually think demonstrating in marching to Grosvenor Square. I mean, we were talking earlier about whether or not it was fun or student occupation. For me, the greatest sense of elation, a very strong sense of elation in my life is being part of a political movement with other people, and that sense of being as one in a crowd. Out there, they've got this film shows about Paris, and there's people in the streets, you can't hear what they're saying, and they're chanting, and I'm thinking, oh yes, I want to be in there. So that was mine, I think. Yes.
So thinking post-68, in the sense of, you have all these sort of cultural revolutions, and the whole hippie thing and all that. And some of the stuff I've read, talks a lot about how that journey inward is actually creates a culture of, or has created a culture to the degree where we have this whole therapeutic sort of society now, where it's not about this class becomes more irrelevant in forms of analysis, and then you at the moment I think what we see a lot of this whole identity politics stuff arguing for just recognition within the system. As long as we've got 0.1% trans people on a board of the company, that's all right. Or if we've got so many people from each group, then that's a success. That's seen as radical in some places, and I just wonder sort of how that since 68 till now, how that sort of culture of individualism fed into maybe the more individualistic 1980s. Now we seem to be coming out. I always feel like we're sort of back into the 1980s at the moment. We've gone through the end of the 70s again, the same sort of arguments being played out in a different way, but yet we still don't seem I still think class is really important. And I just wonder if you have any thoughts on that, sort of 50 years.
I completely agree with everything you said, and certainly at the time there was a big tension between people who saw class politics and struggle and collectivity, whether it was on class basis or race or sex or whatever, as being important, and people who were me, my identity, and I was certainly very disparaging of that tendency, and I would go, bloody hippies, there was a tension in the movement. Some people being able, Barbara was saying that if she could manage to embrace both, but I didn't. I was the collective action, not the identity politics, which I do now think is one of the most damaging. Again, this present stuff about shutting down women's right to speak on the grounds that's subversive and transphobe is one of the most dangerous things I've seen. Yes. How do you think being an activist in 1968 affected your political practice in the decades afterwards? I had been involved with kind of Trotskyist groups in the late 60s and indeed also with the anarchist movement in the late 60s. But from 1970, for the next 10 years, I was explicitly and consciously, I'm coughing with embarrassment, I was a Leninist and had that kind of political practice with kind of true belief of the revolutionary party that was going to make it all right. After 1980, I came to my senses and got much more involved in campaigning on things that you could affect in the here and now.
Yeah, I really liked most of what you said, and I can connect with your point about optimism. I'd say that I'd answer your question in terms of, in a way, the possibility of change within the gave us a kind of underlying optimism about the possibilities of human agency in the face of, decadent, unjust political and economic institutions that appear to be crumbling. But I just would add, in terms of not so much the downside, but explaining the defeat, is certainly the sense I had after the experience of the GLC had reinforced that optimism, of kind of not waking up, but wondering why on earth, almost behind our backs, the right had come into ascendancy. And I'm thinking really about the sometimes invisible economic changes that were taking place that actually from the 60s, the mid-60s onwards, and the economic crisis then and the dominance of finance capital, they were termed the gnomes of Zurich and made all sort of homely, but actually it was a kind of pretty brutal beginnings of globalization and the increasing power of financial forces, then reinforced by the growth of multinational capital. And that, in a sense, all the defeats, if you like, of the 80s and 90s, some of them were directly political, like Thatcher's destruction of the miners, but many were to do with deindustrialization and the sort of destruction of jobs of whole industries because of the finance-driven pressures of industry. And that created a completely different political terrain. It meant national levers of national power were kind of diminished. It contributed to the defeat of Tony Benn and his attempt to champion a movement from below to control capital through workers' power. And maybe, and then in a way we had a social democracy that accommodated to all that. And so I think I'd put more stress on those economic forces and the need to not come to terms with them in the sense of accept them, but work out what strategies give us some power over them, than I would on this question of an individualism in the movement laying the basis for Thatcherism. I mean, I think Thatcher did exploit, there was a kind of way in which that individualism, which in 68, as I said earlier, I think was utterly tied to a collectivism, that we saw in the women's movement, this combination of, individual fulfillment being, based on social solidarity and the social movement. So I really would like to defend that combination, yes, but point to the importance of these economic forces.
I think your analysis, your Marxist analysis, is entirely accurate about the significance, as always, of the economic. So I don't disagree with anything you said, except that you said something about social democracy accommodating to it. But I think Blair and the EFI initiatives are more than an accommodation. The transformation of finance capital and all the destruction that led from that is more than an accommodation. Okay, I think we have to leave, so thank you very much for coming.